everybody, for joining in for another episode of the Reliably Intermittent Podcast. I am Drew Esposito, and I'm coming to you today, November 2nd, on the eve of the election. And I thought now would be a good time to talk about something that we are all probably, as HR professionals, as employers, even as employees, pretty concerned about, which is the aftermath of tomorrow and what it looks like in the workplace. And a lot of people have been dealing with this for, honestly, since 2016, when things really got politicized. But I think it's important to kind of highlight some issues, at least that I see, that concern me in the workplace, that I think everybody should be kind of on their toes about if they are in this field of employment law, human resource management, labor law. They all have a crossover. So I don't think anybody can argue that right now in this day and age, it hasn't been a more politicized environment, probably in most people's lifetime, right? Unless you are a couple, maybe traditionalists, people that were born in the 1940s, you probably haven't seen real politicization like this. Yes, you had the civil rights movement and all that, but things that didn't exist at the time, like social media and technology, it really kept that aspect of that movement to the streets, right, and in the news, not in the workplace. You just didn't have that. And to be frank, the workplace probably wasn't as diverse, right? We didn't have these laws that resulted in a much more diverse workplace. So we have lots of things that have been impacting the workplace. So, you have little things that seem innocuous, right? I heard a story recently about an employee, and I think this was around 2017, around the Women's March area, where an employee had posted either a poster or a framed picture, which basically said "Stop White Supremacy," and I think everybody would agree that that is, generally speaking, a good notion, a supportive notion, and really not offensive. And this is the problem with generalities. Another employee came and complained about that sign to HR, and they said that white supremacy is code for Trump. So they were seeing it as a direct attack on their conservative values, on their conservative beliefs, on their political view. And it made that HR person have it to think about postings and displays in the workforce in a whole different view. And as we become more and more political and become more and more ingrained and identify these disagreements, right, become even more present and can lead to really serious concerns in the workplace, whether it's workplace violence, whether it's discrimination, harassment, a whole plethora of things that can come up. So what I am seeing, right, is that people are becoming so entrenched that individuals are not respecting other people who don't share their same beliefs, right? And if you're coming from that identity, right, and you may have heard this term, really identity politics, where it really doesn't matter the position of the political party. You actually just identify with the politics, and you can be part of a party that has one position on a Monday and another and a completely opposite position on a Tuesday. It doesn't matter. You will support it because you identify with that political party, regardless of what they do. Right. And that is what we are seeing. I think anybody on the left, right, or middle who does not agree with that is suffering from identity politics. They're not willing to have a critical view of actually what's happening in the workplace. So when I say entrenched, a lot of times the question I ask to individuals in the audience, to employers that I'm advising, is I say, is respecting another employee, right? Is respect in the workplace, is that a primary goal of human resources? Is that a primary goal of a good workplace culture? Is it important to have respect for one another? And unanimously, 100%, the answer is yes. No one is out there saying, no, we should not respect each other. We shouldn't do that. And if you have that as a premise, then you can start breaking down. And I would advise you to not focus on the politics, but having different political beliefs is okay, but you still have to respect each other. And if that is an agreed upon premise for the workplace, then we should hopefully be able to avoid some of the nastiness that comes out, right? And if we can avoid that, then you can avoid the workplace violence, we can avoid the fights, we can avoid all of that stuff. So some ideas that HR professionals and that managers can do to head off these problems are little things, right? Establish policies, perform training sessions, things like that. But you're not going to be able to do that in the next 24 hours, right? The election is coming up. So I think some of the more practical things is you want to understand what's the difference between an opinion and harassment. I think this is a really, really important one. Is we need to educate our employees on a differentiation between harassment and opinion. And expressing your support for one candidate or one belief is not necessarily harassment. And more commonly, right, you cannot use political opinion as a disguise for harassment, right? So if you just say, hey, I'm having my First Amendment rights, I'm speaking my my mind, my political speech, so I can say what I want. No, that does not work, right? That does not work if what you're doing is violating policy, is treating people unfairly, is making people feel left out, all sorts of things. You know, a lack of professionalism, a lack of decorum, uh, maybe violating other policies like dress codes and things like that. All those come into play. And so often employees, right, rely on this whole First Amendment freedom speech, my opinion, right, to try to say, so you can't be mad at me, or I can't get in trouble for having an opinion. And I think that employers and supervisors need to be very, very clear with all their staff is that you are free to have your opinion, right? But that does not protect you from anything. So I'll dive into one of the common misconceptions, first of all, just to differentiate between public and private sector workplaces. We get this question all the time, or I get it all the time and speak on it, frankly, many, many times a year, which is this is my First Amendment right. Let's just be clear for those of you listening that are private sector employers, that are private sector managers, you can essentially disregard the First Amendment argument. It does not apply to you. That does not mean that you guys can go out there and shouldn't double check your jurisdiction to figure out if there are any protections. There are several states that have their own variation that make retaliation or discrimination based on political speech also illegal. There's also this, the private sector area, the NLRA, right, the National Labor Relations Act, that protects speech related to hours, conditions, terms, wages of employment. So you got to be very careful, right? It's not just a blanket thing where you just want to say, oh, there's no protection, therefore I can do what I want. But when an employee evokes the First Amendment in the private sector, it has no bearing, right? The First Amendment prohibits the government from censoring speech. Now, for you public sector clients out there, you do need to be concerned about it, right? When you do policies and procedures, when you have certain restrictions in the workplace, that may run afoul of people's First Amendment rights. So there's two different analyses that have to be performed depending on who you work for or what type of employer you are. And this is a common issue because when we talk in the human resource realm, there's a lot of crossover, don't get me wrong, but you'll hear, you know, your coworker or your peer talking about, well, just do this, they can't do that, but they don't work in the public sector or they work in the private sector, and there isn't a crossover here. So you need to be very, very careful on how you apply it. Now, as these tensions run high and we're looking for solutions and we're searching for solutions, there's a gentleman named Michael Times who had a really good quote that I'm just going to read to you. Is he said when he's talking about his agency, his employers said, "We respect the diversity of opinion. At the end of the day, we value what everybody brings to the organization, but we also tie it back to the fact that if the behavior does not follow our policies, there will be accountability." I think that is a really succinct, very clear, and covers a lot of bases when talking about political speech in the time of unprecedented tensions in the workplace. So we will respect the diversity of opinion. And keep in mind the focus on this quote too. He's not focusing on politics, right? This is really about everything, right? We respect diversity of opinion, diversity of thought. We're not a thought police in our agencies and our employers. We value what you bring. We value the diversity of opinion. I love that statement. However, if the behavior does not follow our policies, there will be accountability, right? So if you are disrespecting another person, right? If you are calling them names, right? Using a lot of the derogatory terminology that comes with classification of the left or the right, right? There's going to be accountability. And that is the message that you want to hammer home, okay? And you want to drill it in really yesterday, a month ago, right? But I would say coming in tomorrow and the next day as results start coming in, managers and supervisors should really take heed of what's going on out there, because there could be some really nasty things that arise. I'm genuinely not an alarmist. I think there's very little that can happen that actually changes the scope of what's going on. That's the wonderful system of checks and balances that we have. This is an exception where I've been a little bit on edge, more uncharacteristically. It's not in my nature to really get nervous about stuff like this, but I see a lot of unrest, and I see a lot of aggressive tactics being done by both sides, whether it is protesters that then get kind of usurped with bad actors, right? Whether it's rally goers that are getting a little bit more aggressive, on how they're operating on public roadways and things like that. I mean, these are leading to direct confrontations, and I just don't recall seeing it like this in my time. Another aspect that you should consider is a review of your social media policies and being on top of what it is. I would advise all of you employers, all of you supervisors, to strongly consider advising people, right, to avoid social media and politics. I think these are echo chambers that just fuel hate and fuel divisiveness. But I also think that it's unrealistic if an employer thinks they're going to put in a social media policy or just regular personnel policy that bans all type of political speech. I don't think that's realistic. I don't think you'll be able to enforce it. Are you going to enforce it on yourself? What if your boss decides to have political speech? I've read a lot of recent articles where the CEOs of the companies, have sent down these letters, basically saying, if you vote this way, just to let you know, it's not going to be good for our business, right? Some pretty heavy-handed tactics. And if you have the boss that's doing that, your rank and file are certainly going to be able to talk about it. Or why wouldn't they, right? You're not leading by example. So the reality is you need to talk about what will be considered opinion, what will be considered harassment, and you need to talk about what the effect is. And there is a lot of data out there about this stuff happening through social media at workplace. There's a recent survey, I think it was from 2017, that said something like 87, maybe even 90% of employees are reading political posts during their workday. In the mid 70s, are talking about politics in the workplace. And so, like, the reality is, you're not going to be able to stop it. Are you going to enforce discipline on 70% of your workplace? No. The common saying that I always say is 5% of my employees cause 95% of my problems. So we need to control that 5%. It's the 5% that are stirring the pot. They may be going from the opinion to the harassment, right? They may be trying to work other people into a frenzy that are otherwise maybe talking about their opinions in a respectful manner. That's what we need to address. We need to stop the hype, right? Stop. We don't want hype in the workplace about political actions. So a lot of this goes around getting personal with other coworkers and things like that. And you just need to be really careful. It's a good dose to remind employees about professionalism and ultimately respect. If you don't think it's going to happen to you, I will say it will. Um, I don't have a single client right now that isn't embroiled in some sort of political turmoil, right? They're all nervous about this election on both sides. So you're going to have it. And you're going to deal with it. What's going to happen after one of these candidates wins? Ask yourself that. What's going to happen after one of these candidates wins? And you have employees who come in with their victory shirts and their victory buttons. And you're going to have a large segment of your employees who are on the other side, just statistically speaking, right? Since it's virtually like 50-50 out there, who are seeing that as a provocation, being antagonized. This is either side. How are you going to deal with that? And you shouldn't be reacting, right? We need to be proactive in this, right? So you have time to get this message out there through internal memos, through meetings, but I think you need to address it now. If you're waiting for these results to trickle in, you're going to be too late. So I think focusing on the idea that I said at the top, that it's about respect, is the best way to go about this angle. That not that you're censoring opinion, but that you're focusing on a culture of respect. And if you can focus on a culture of respect, then hopefully people will, maybe this is wishful thinking, people will self-edit their thought, right? Think before you speak. They'll express their opinions, but they won't do so in a manner that's inflammatory or that is distracting. They also shouldn't be spending, hours and hours on end dealing and talking about these issues, right? You come here to do a job, and your job, generally speaking, right, isn't to talk about politics. So you got to be very, very careful of how this is handled. And I truly don't know how employers are going to deal with it, but that would be the first step. I think the very first step that needs to happen in the next 24 to 36 hours is employers, managers, supervisors need to get a grip on what is going to happen. They should draft concise policies about expectations or set concise expectations on behavior, right? And then set the example themselves. They need to steer these conversations. They need to prevent gloating. This is like being a good winner or a poor loser, right? This is going back to, kindergarten level social norms, right? I almost feel like this is a good example of why it's important to have competitive sports and not be part of the everybody's a winner, everybody gets a participation trophy society. Is you got to learn how to deal with losing, right? And shaking the other team's hand. And if you're the winner, right, you don't win and then go on the the center of the field and stomp on the other team's mascot or whatever have you, whatever symbol of that school is prideful. That's what leads to the fights. And these are the things that you learn as children. But something has happened in the past, 4 years, probably the past 12, right? I'm not naive to say that the 2016 election triggered this, right? The divisiveness really probably started when Obama got elected and then just ramped up. So it's probably been building for 12 years. So this is something that's been festering. stain, on us for sure, that we can't figure out a better way to talk to each other's citizens, but at least in the workplace, we can control it, right? And we don't need to tolerate it. You don't need to buy into this whole thing that there's nothing I can do. And I think you're an ostrich putting your head in the sand if you think you can implement some sort of zero tolerance policy. If you think you're doing a zero tolerance policy, you're probably the same employer that tried to implement a zero tolerance policy on internet use and social media use and smartphone use, 10, 15 years ago, right? It's not practical and it's not going to happen, right? This is about educating the workforce, right? It's about preventing behavior, not reacting. So with that, I know it was a quick one, but I was really weighing on me heavily this morning on the eve of this election on what some of my clients are going to be going through. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I will be. If you are facing these difficult issues, before you do anything, definitely make sure to check your local area to make sure you don't have any really specific responses. If you're out in California, Colorado, Virginia, Utah, I guess, there's various laws retaliating against employees who prohibiting employers from retaliating against employees who engage in political activity. I don't necessarily think like gloating and saying, look, we won, you lost. To me, that's not really political activity, but I don't know. I don't live in California, but you want to understand these distinctions before you open up Pandora's box and open yourself up for liability. So keep that in mind. Try to be proactive in your approach and try to educate employees and say, what do we value as a culture? Do we value respect? If the answer is yes, which it should be, that will hopefully start the discussion on how we're going to act after November 3rd. Thank you guys for joining in for another episode. I know it was a quick one. I hope everybody survives tomorrow, and please subscribe, like, share, and thank you for tuning in. Have a good one.
We want to thank you again for joining us on the Reliably Intermittent podcast. Now it's time for a bit of a disclaimer. This podcast and all others on this feed are for informational purposes only and not legal advice. No attorney-client relationship is formed by listening to this podcast or any others on the feed. Should you require or want legal advice, we encourage you to reach out to an attorney or statutory legal counsel as the case may be. Thanks again for joining us, and we will talk to you next time.